The sound of the zipper being opened cut through the silent night like a knife. My heart pounded, and for a second I thought I was going to die right there, alone in the forest, with no one to tell the story. Subscribe to the channel and leave a like to get access to more stories like this. It was my second night camping in the Oregon mountains, miles from any living soul. I had come here specifically to get away from everything and everyone, especially the memories of Rodrigo, and how he could make me feel invisible even when we were in the same room. 2 years of a relationship where I was always too much or too little, never just right for him. I was lying in my sleeping bag when I heard footsteps approaching my tent. I thought of bears, of bad people, of all the horror stories you hear about solo camping. But nothing prepared me to hear a male voice whispering softly, "Damn, I thought this place was empty." I froze. His flashlight's beam danced through the canvas of my tent, creating strange shadows. I heard him setting up a tent just a few feet away, trying his best to be quiet but failing miserably. Each stake he hammered into the ground echoed through the forest like a drum. My mind raced through different strategies. Should I pretend to be asleep? Go out and confront the intruder? Call someone? Of course there was no cell service in this godforsaken place. That's exactly why I had chosen this location, to be completely disconnected from the digital world that had become my prison. What you hear here is just the beginning. The complete, unfiltered stories with all the details you can imagine are available now. Check out the link in the description right now. I've been a software engineer for 5 years, always glued to screens, always available to solve other people's problems. In the last few months, especially after the breakup with Rodrigo, my house had become a cave where I hid from the world. My friends stopped calling me to go out. My family stopped insisting on Sunday lunches. I had become a ghost in my own life. That's why I was there, in the middle of nowhere, with a backpack full of camping gear I barely knew how to use, and a ridiculous hope that 3 days in nature could fix what 3 years of therapy couldn't. I wanted to reconnect with myself, to find out who Derek was when no one was telling me I wasn't enough. The stranger finally finished setting up his tent and fell silent. I could hear my own breathing, which was faster than I'd like to admit. The sound of the creek that used to soothe me now seemed too loud, masking any other noise that might give me clues about my new, uninvited neighbor's intentions. I must have been 28, but at that moment, I felt like a scared child. Rodrigo always said I was too dramatic, that I turned normal situations into catastrophes in my head. Maybe he was right. Maybe the guy was just another camper who, like me, wanted to escape civilization for a few days. But it was 2 in the morning. Who sets up camp at 2 in the morning? Finally, after what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, I heard the voice again, this time clearer. "Sorry if I woke you up. I got lost on the trail and thought this place was deserted." It was a deep, tired voice, but it carried a genuine kindness. It wasn't the voice of someone who wanted to harm me. I took a deep breath and decided to answer. "It's okay," I said, trying to sound braver than I felt. "It's all good. Seriously, man, I'm sorry. I can keep walking if you prefer. I know it must be weird having someone show up out of nowhere like this." Something about the way he spoke, with a genuine concern not to bother me, made me relax a little. I unzipped my tent and poked my head out. The light from his flashlight momentarily blinded me, but I could make out the silhouette of a tall man with messy hair and a huge backpack on his back. "You don't have to keep going in the dark," I said, surprised by my own generosity. "You can stay until morning." "Are you sure?" "I promise I won't bother you." "I'm sure." He turned off his flashlight and I heard him settling into his tent. "Thanks, man. Really. My name is Adrian, by the way. Derek. Nice to meet you, Derek. And sorry again for the intrusion." I went back inside my tent, but sleep was completely gone. We stayed in silence for a few minutes, each in his own tent, probably thinking about the strangeness of the situation. I was processing how an encounter that started as my worst nightmare had turned into something almost welcoming. Rodrigo always said I was naive, that I trusted people too easily. "You need to be smarter, Derek. The world isn't this rosy place you think it is." But there I was, at 28, offering shelter to a complete stranger in the middle of the forest. And for some reason, I felt I was doing the right thing. Dawn came slowly, painting the sky with shades of pink and orange that filtered through the tops of the pine trees. I woke up to the sound of Adrian rustling outside, probably packing up his things to leave. I felt a strange pang of disappointment. I got out of the tent and saw him for the first time in daylight. He must have been in his early 30s, with brown hair messy from sleep, tired but kind eyes, and a 5 o'clock shadow that gave him an adventurous look. He was taller than me, and had broad shoulders that filled out his hiking shirt nicely. "Good morning," he said, smiling. "Sleep well after the alien invasion?" I laughed. It was the first time I had genuinely laughed in weeks. "Did the invading alien sleep well?" "Like a rock. Thanks again for letting me stay." I was really done for yesterday. Adrian was organizing his backpack with precise movements, clearly someone experienced with hiking. I, on the other hand, was still trying to figure out how to fold my sleeping bag properly. "Want some coffee?" he offered, taking a small coffee kit out of his backpack. "It's the least I can do after invading your peace and quiet." "That would be great." While he prepared the coffee on a small portable stove, I took the opportunity to observe him better. There was something about him that exuded calm, a way of moving that suggested someone comfortable with himself and his surroundings. He was the opposite of Rodrigo, who always seemed anxious, always rushing to the next appointment, the next goal, the next reason to be dissatisfied. "Have you been hiking for a long time?" I asked. "About 5 years. I started after my brother died. It was our thing, you know? We'd go to the mountains every weekend. After he was gone, I kept coming back alone. It's my way of keeping the connection with him, I guess." The way he spoke about the loss was simple, without drama, but it was heavy with a sadness I recognized. It was the sadness of someone who had learned to carry the pain without letting it define everything. "I'm sorry," I said. "Thanks. What about you? Is this your first time here?" "First time camping alone, actually. I'm trying to, I don't know, reconnect with myself, maybe?" Sounds a bit ridiculous saying it out loud. Doesn't sound ridiculous. Sometimes we need to get lost to find ourselves. The coffee was ready, and he handed me a steaming mug. It was the best coffee I'd had in a long time. Or maybe it was just the context. The crisp morning air, the sound of the creek, the unexpected company of someone who didn't know me well enough to have expectations about who I should be. "Do you know this area well?" I asked. "Reasonably. I have a route I do every year around the same time. There are some incredible places around here that don't even show up on tourist maps." "Like what?" "There's a waterfall about a 2-hour hike from here that's breathtaking. The water is so clear you can see the bottom even in the deepest spots." I felt a pang of curiosity. My original plan was to just stay around the campsite, read, write in my journal, maybe walk a bit on the nearest trails. But the idea of seeing this waterfall attracted me in a way I couldn't explain. "That sounds amazing," I said. "If you want, I can show you the way before I continue my route." The offer caught me by surprise. Rodrigo always said I was too dependent, that I needed to learn to do things on my own. "You can't expect me to always be available for your little adventures, Derek." But here was a complete stranger offering the exact opposite, company for an adventure. "Won't you be late?" "I have a few days off. A detour won't make a difference." There was something in the way he said it, casual but with a touch of hope, that made me realize maybe he wasn't in such a hurry to continue alone either. Then, yes, I'd love to see that waterfall. The smile he gave me was genuine and completely transformed his tired face. "Perfect. We can leave after breakfast if you want. It's an easy hike, nothing too challenging." We finished our coffee in a comfortable silence, each lost in our own thoughts. I was trying to process how my solitary journey of self-discovery had gained such an unexpected companion. There was something liberating about being with someone who knew nothing about my previous life, about my failures, about how Rodrigo could make me feel small with just a look. Adrian was different. There was a calm presence about him, a way of listening that made me feel truly heard. When he talked about his brother, his eyes would drift off a little, but there was no bitterness there, just a sweet and mature longing. "What do you do for work?" he asked as he washed the mugs in the creek. "Software engineering. I spend most of my time glued to computers, solving problems that other people created." "Must be pretty different from this?" "Completely. It's kind of scary, actually. I can't remember the last time I went this long without checking email or social media. It's liberating once you get used to it. The first few days I always feel like I'm forgetting something important. But then I realize I rarely forget anything truly important." He was right. Since I had gotten there, I had caught myself automatically reaching for my phone several times. A reflex so ingrained I didn't even notice it anymore. But now, talking to Adrian, I didn't miss the digital world at all. We packed up our gear and started the hike towards the waterfall. Adrian knew the way well, pointing out interesting plants, explaining about the different types of trees, telling stories about animals he had encountered there. It wasn't that forced knowledge of someone who had read about the subject. It was the knowledge of someone who truly paid attention to the world around him. The trail was more challenging than he had suggested, but not uncomfortably so. We climbed over rocky terrain, crossed small streams, and passed through forests so dense that the sunlight reached the ground in golden beams. Adrian maintained a pace that was challenging for me without being impossible, and he always checked to see if I was keeping up. "You good?" he asked during a water break. "Better than I thought. I don't get much exercise, to be honest." "You're doing great. The waterfall is worth it, I promise." During the hike, our conversation flowed naturally. We talked about work, about the city, about the small frustrations of modern life. Adrian was a high school literature teacher, and he had a way of talking about his students that showed a genuine passion for what he did. "Must be rewarding," I commented. "It has its moments. It's amazing when you can get a 15-year-old boy to fall in love with Shakespeare, or when a shy girl finds her voice through writing. But there are also days when you feel like you're talking to walls." "How do you stay motivated?" "I remember my brother. He hated school, was always more hands-on, but he had a natural curiosity about people. He said I had a gift for making complicated things seem simple. I guess I try to honor that." There was an emotional maturity in Adrian that attracted me. Rodrigo always ran away from deeper conversations, changed the subject when things got too personal. "You overthink things, Derek. Not everything needs to have a deep meaning." But with Adrian, deep conversations flowed naturally. He wasn't afraid to talk about loss, about purpose, about the complexities of being human. And most importantly, he truly listened when I spoke. He didn't wait for his turn to talk or give unsolicited advice. He just listened. When we finally reached the waterfall, I understood why Adrian had insisted it was worth it. The water fell from a height of about 20 meters into a natural pool of polished rocks. The water was so clear we could see small fish swimming at the bottom. The sound of the water hitting the rocks created a natural music that seemed to wash away any tension I was still carrying on my shoulders. "Oh my God," I whispered. "I know, right? I come here every time I do this trail. It never gets less impressive." We sat on the rocks near the edge, took off our boots, and put our feet in the cold water. The contrast between the cold water and the warmth of the sun on our backs was perfect. Adrian took a bottle with a filter from his backpack and filled it with water from the waterfall. "Is it safe to drink?" I asked. "With the filter, yes. It's the purest water you'll ever find." He offered me a sip, and he was right. It was the cleanest, most refreshing water I had ever tasted. We sat there, watching the waterfall, each lost in our own thoughts. There was no rush, no schedule, just two men enjoying a perfect moment in nature. "Thank you for bringing me here," I said finally. "Thank you for letting me stay yesterday, and for agreeing to come. It's more fun to share these places with someone." There was something in the way he said it that made me look at him more carefully. Adrian was watching the waterfall, but I felt his attention was on me. Not in an uncomfortable way, but in a way that made me feel truly seen. Rodrigo always made me feel like I was too much, too emotional, too intense, too present. With Adrian, for the first time in a long time, I felt like my presence was welcome, even desired. We returned from the waterfall in the middle of the afternoon, with dark clouds forming on the horizon. Adrian commented that he should continue his journey before the storm, but something about the way he said it didn't sound very convincing. I, who had planned to spend these days completely alone, found myself secretly hoping he would change his mind. "Looks like it's going to be a strong storm," I said, looking at the increasingly heavy sky. "Yeah, it is. These mountain storms come fast and are intense." We stood there, both clearly thinking the same thing, but neither wanting to be the first to suggest it. There was a tension in the air that had nothing to do with the approaching storm. It was as if we were dancing around something we both wanted but didn't know how to ask for. "You can stay," I said finally, trying to sound casual. "I mean, if you want. It doesn't make sense for you to leave in this weather." The smile he gave me was different from the others. It had something more intimate, more personal. "I was hoping you'd offer." The first drops of rain began to fall as we were organizing our gear. They soon turned into a torrential downpour that made a deafening noise hitting the leaves of the trees. Adrian had set up his tent in a hurry the night before, and it was clear it wasn't prepared for a storm like this. "My tent is bigger and more resistant," I yelled over the sound of the rain. "Come over here." He didn't hesitate. He grabbed his sleeping bag and a few essential belongings and ran to my tent. We both got soaked in the few seconds it took for him to transfer, laughing like children as we squeezed into the space that suddenly seemed much smaller than I remembered. "Sorry for the mess," he said, dripping water everywhere. "It's okay. At least we're dry now." But we weren't really dry. Both of us had our wet clothes clinging to our bodies, and the confined space of the tent made every movement seem more intimate than it should. Adrian took off his wet shirt without ceremony, revealing a chest defined by years of hiking and outdoor activities. I tried not to look, but it was impossible to ignore. "You should take those wet clothes off too," he said, noticing I was trembling slightly. He was right, but I felt strangely vulnerable. It wasn't like I had never been shirtless near another man, but there was something different about the situation. Maybe it was the forced intimacy of the small space, or maybe it was the way Adrian looked at me, not with judgment, but with an acceptance I wasn't used to receiving. I took off my shirt and we both stood there, shirtless, trying to warm up with our sleeping bags. The sound of the rain on the canvas created a kind of sound cocoon around us, completely isolating us from the outside world. It was as if we were the only two people in the universe. "This is the part where we find out if we really know each other well enough to be stuck together in a 2 square meter space," Adrian joked. "And what if we find out we don't? Then we'll have to learn fast." The conversation we had in those first few hours in the tent was unlike any I'd ever had in my life. Maybe it was the forced intimacy, or maybe it was the fact that we had nothing else but each other's presence. But we started talking about things that normally take months to share. I told Adrian about Rodrigo, about how our relationship had started full of promises and gradually turned into something that made me question my own existence. How Rodrigo had a gift for making comments that seemed casual, but cut deep. "You always overreact to everything, Derek," or, "I don't know why you can't just relax and be normal." He made me feel like I was defective, I admitted, surprised by my own honesty. Like there was something fundamentally wrong with me that I needed to fix. Adrian listened without interrupting, without offering easy advice or comforting platitudes. When I finished, he was silent for a few minutes before responding. "You're not defective," he said simply. "And anyone who can make you believe you are, that person, is the one with a problem." There was a conviction in his voice that caught me off guard. It wasn't just polite kindness. He truly believed what he was saying. Adrian shared about his twin brother, Marcus, who had died in a car accident 2 years earlier. It wasn't just a tragic death. It was a loss that completely redefined how Adrian saw the world and his place in it. "We were physically identical, but completely different in personality," he said. "He was extroverted. I was introspective. He loved people. I loved books. But we worked perfectly together. It was like we were two halves of one complete person." After Marcus's death, Adrian closed himself off to close relationships. The solitary hikes weren't just a way to process grief. They were a way to avoid the possibility of feeling the pain of loss again. "I haven't allowed myself to connect with people for a long time," he admitted. "It's safer to keep my distance." "And now?" He looked directly at me. "Now I'm questioning if security is more important than connection." The intensity of his gaze made me realize we were no longer just talking about general life philosophies. We were talking about us, about what was happening there in that tent, about the electricity I felt growing between us with each passing hour. The space between us in the tent seemed to be naturally shrinking. It wasn't intentional, at least not consciously, but our bodies were moving closer as if attracted by a magnetic force. When Adrian reached for water, his fingers brushed mine. When I turned to grab something from my backpack, my shoulder touched his. Each accidental touch sent an electric current through my body. I began to notice details about him that I hadn't paid attention to before. The way his eyes narrowed slightly when he smiled. How his voice got lower when he talked about personal things. How he had a small scar on his chin that gave an asymmetrical charm to his face. "Derek," he said in a moment of silence, his voice lower than normal. "Can I ask you a personal question? After everything we've already talked about?" "Of course. When was the last time you felt truly seen by someone? Not just tolerated or accepted, but genuinely seen and appreciated?" The question caught me completely off guard. I sat there, trying to remember, and realized with horror that I couldn't find a recent answer. Rodrigo never made me feel seen. He made me feel analyzed, judged, always finding something that needed to be fixed. My friends liked me, but in a superficial way. My family loved me, but more out of obligation than genuine admiration for who I was. "I don't know," I answered honestly. "It's been a long time. That's so sad. You deserve to feel seen. And you? When was the last time you felt truly connected with someone? Besides Marcus? Never, I guess. At least not romantically." The word, romantically, hung in the air between us like an unintentional confession. Adrian seemed to realize what he had said and blushed slightly. But he didn't try to take it back or explain. Instead, we looked directly into each other's eyes, and for the first time since we met, the air was charged with a tension that was unequivocally sexual. Adrian, I began, but I didn't know how to finish the sentence. I know, he said softly. I feel it too. The storm outside was at its peak, but inside the tent the world had shrunk to just the two of us and the increasingly small space between our bodies. Adrian raised his hand and touched my face, his fingers tracing the line of my jaw with a delicacy that made me close my eyes involuntarily. Can I kiss you? He asked, his voice just a whisper. Instead of answering with words, I leaned forward. Our lips met in a kiss that was anything but hesitant. It was as if all the tension and connection of the last 2 days had been concentrated in that moment. The kiss wasn't desperate or urgent. It was deep, exploratory, as if we were mapping a new but familiar territory. When we separated, we rested our foreheads against each other, breathing in the same rhythm. This is crazy, I whispered. The best kind of crazy I've ever lived, he replied. Adrian's hands found my waist, pulling me closer. Our bodies fit together perfectly, as if they had been designed to complement each other. Every touch was both a question and an answer at the same time, a careful exploration of unknown territory that we both wanted to discover. He kissed my neck, his hands exploring the lines of my body as if he were reading a map in Braille. Every touch sent waves of pleasure through me, waking up parts of me that had been dormant for a long time. With Rodrigo, sex always felt mechanical, an obligation to be fulfilled. With Adrian, every movement seemed loaded with meaning and intention. Are you sure? He asked, stopping to look into my eyes. I've never been so sure of anything in my life. What happened next was like a symphony played in slow motion. Adrian explored my body with a reverence that made me feel like a work of art. His hands traced maps on my skin, discovering sensitive spots I didn't know existed. When our skin met completely, it was as if two puzzle pieces had finally found their correct places. The rhythm between us grew naturally, like waves coming to shore. It started gentle and exploratory, two people learning each other's contours, discovering what made the other sigh, what made the other arch their back in pleasure. Adrian whispered my name like it was a prayer, and I responded with movements that expressed everything words couldn't. Our bodies moved in perfect sync, as if we had been practicing this intimate dance for years. Every movement was both a question and an answer, an exploration of limits and possibilities. When Adrian touched me in places no one had touched with such reverence before, I felt as if I was being redefined, discovering parts of myself that I didn't know existed. The climax arrived like a wave that carried us together, our bodies trembling in perfect harmony as the world around us completely disappeared. For a few infinite moments, we existed only in the space between breaths, suspended in an intimacy that went far beyond the physical. After, we stayed embraced, listening to the last drops of rain on the tent's canvas. The outside world was slowly coming back into focus, but I wasn't ready to let that moment go. Adrian traced lazy circles on my chest, his breathing still slightly accelerated. How do you feel? He asked softly. Different, I answered honestly. Like a part of me that was asleep has woken up. Me too. I didn't expect to feel this way so soon, or maybe ever again. There was a vulnerability in his voice that made me realize this had been just as transformative for him as it was for me. It wasn't just sex, it was a rediscovery of our capacities for connection and intimacy. Adrian, I began, but he placed a finger on my lips. We don't have to define this now, he said. We can just feel, be present. He was right. For the first time in a long time, I didn't want to analyze or categorize what had happened. I just wanted to exist in that moment, in that suspended space between who I was before and who I was becoming. We fell asleep intertwined, our breaths synchronizing naturally. Even in sleep, my body sought his warmth, as if it recognized that it had found its place of belonging. The last thing I remember before falling completely asleep was the sound of the rain outside dying down, and the feeling of a deep peace I hadn't experienced in years. When I woke up a few hours later, Adrian was still there, watching me with a soft smile on his lips. The storm had passed, but neither of us seemed in a hurry to leave that intimate cocoon we had created. Good morning again, he said, his voice raspy with sleep. Good morning, I replied, realizing how natural it felt to wake up next to him. But along with the naturalness, reality also came. Adrian had his trail to complete. I had my journey back to the city. At some point, we would have to leave that tent and face what it meant, what had happened between us. For now, though, we were content to simply exist in that space between before and after, savoring an intimacy that neither of us wanted to end. The morning arrived with a golden clarity that filtered through the tent's canvas, creating an almost magical atmosphere. But along with the light also came the inevitable reality. Adrian needed to continue his trail, and I needed to decide what to do with the feelings that had been born in that small bubble of intimacy we created. We lay there in silence for a while, both aware that talking about the future would break the magic of the present moment. Adrian traced imaginary patterns on my chest with his fingers, a gesture so intimate and natural, it felt like we had been doing it for years. "I have reservations at other points on the trail," he said finally, his voice heavy with a reluctance that mirrored exactly what I was feeling. "And I need to go back to the city tomorrow," I replied. "I have a meeting on Monday." The words came out like a confession of failure, as if we were admitting defeat to forces greater than us. Real life existed beyond that forest, with its obligations, schedules, and expectations that had no room for magical encounters with strangers who became intimate in a matter of days. "Derek," Adrian turned to look at me directly. "I don't want this to end here." "Me neither." "Then let's figure out how to make it work." There was a determination in his voice that gave me hope, but also a realistic dose of apprehension. He lived a 3-hour drive from my city. We both had established lives, routines, responsibilities. How to fit what had been born between us into this pragmatic world? We got dressed slowly, each movement a small goodbye. We made coffee together for the last time, and even that simple activity was loaded with melancholy. It was impressive how basic gestures had gained deep meaning in such a short time. "I want to give you something," Adrian said, rummaging in his backpack. He took out a small, worn leather notebook. "It's where I write about the trails, about the places I visit. I want you to have it." I quickly flipped through the pages and saw detailed descriptions of landscapes, personal reflections, even small drawings of plants and animals he had found along the way. It was like receiving a part of his soul. "I can't accept this. It's too personal." "That's exactly why. I want you to take a part of me with you." I accepted the notebook, feeling the weight of the trust he was placing in me. In return, I took a small pendant my grandmother had given me from my pocket. A small silver tree I always carried with me. "It was my grandmother's," I explained. "She said trees teach us about permanence and change at the same time. They stay in the same place, but they never stop growing." Adrian closed his hand around the pendant and kissed it before putting it on his neck. "I'll carry this with me on every trail." We exchanged phone numbers, contact information, addresses, practical data that seemed insufficient to capture the intensity of what we had shared. How to summarize in digits and words the way he had made me feel seen for the first time in years. "I'll text you when I get to the next point," he promised. "And I'll tell you what it was like to go back to civilization after all this." We both knew we were making promises that might be difficult to keep once we returned to our normal lives. But we needed to believe that what had happened between us was strong enough to survive distance and routine. The moment of goodbye came too quickly. Adrian adjusted his backpack on his back, checked that he had everything he needed to continue the trail. I stood there, trying to memorize every detail of his face, the way the morning sun highlighted the golden reflections in his brown hair. "I don't know how to thank you," he said, "for letting me stay, for showing me that I can still connect with someone this way. Thank you for showing up in my life when I needed you most, even if it was by chance." "Do you think it was by chance?" The question caught me off guard. I looked around, at the forest that had witnessed our connection, at the creek that had been our soundtrack, at the clearing where two lonely people had found in each other exactly what they needed. "I don't know. Maybe some things are bigger than chance." Adrian came closer and kissed me one last time. It wasn't a passionate kiss like the ones from the night before. It was a kiss of promise, of gratitude, of hope. A kiss that tried to say everything words couldn't express. "See you, Derek." "See you, Adrian." He continued up the trail, and I stood there until he disappeared completely among the trees. Even after I couldn't see him anymore, I kept listening to his footsteps gradually fade, until the only sound was again that of the creek running beside me. The loneliness I had sought by coming to that forest now felt heavy and empty. The silence that was once comforting now echoed with his absence. I went back to my tent and started packing my things, but every object reminded me of a moment we had shared. I spent the rest of the day hiking alone on the nearby trails, trying to process everything that had happened. I had come to that forest fleeing a relationship that made me feel small and invisible. In 3 days, I had found someone who made me feel the exact opposite: big, visible, important. But more than that, I had rediscovered parts of myself I thought I had lost. The ability to open up to someone, to be vulnerable without fear, to trust in my own capacity for connection. Rodrigo had spent 2 years convincing me that I was too much in every sense. Adrian had shown me that being too much could be exactly what someone was looking for. On my last night in the forest, I lit a campfire and opened the notebook Adrian had given me. I read his descriptions of other places, his reflections on loneliness and connection, his observations on how nature helped him process the loss of his brother. It was like having an intimate conversation with him even while being alone. On the last page, I found a note he had written specifically for me. Derek, if you're reading this, it means we've parted ways, but I hope not forever. These 3 days reminded me of something I had forgotten, that life is not just about surviving losses, but about being open to the new connections that can arise when we least expect them. You gave me an invaluable gift, the memory of what it's like to be completely seen and accepted by someone. I hope I did the same for you. Until we meet again. I closed the notebook with tears in my eyes. They weren't tears of sadness, but of a deep gratitude for having experienced something so pure and transformative. The trip back to the city the next day was like returning from another planet. The traffic, the noise, the constant rush of people. Everything seemed artificial after the days in the forest. But as strange as it was to readjust to urban life, I was not the same person who had left home 4 days earlier. There was a new confidence in me, a certainty about my own worth that didn't depend on anyone else's validation. When the inevitable messages from Rodrigo arrived, reconciliation attempts that always followed the same manipulative pattern, I read them without feeling the familiar pain in my chest. For the first time, I could see them for what they really were. Attempts by someone to keep me in a role that no longer fit me. I replied politely but firmly that I had moved on, that I wished him all the best, but that our chapter had come to an end. Blocking his number was surprisingly easy. It was like closing a door that had been ajar for months, letting in cold drafts. At work, my colleagues commented that I seemed different. "You're more present," my boss said during a meeting. "More confident in your ideas." It was true. The insecurities Rodrigo had planted in me about my professional competence had simply evaporated. I remembered how Adrian listened to my opinions with genuine interest, how he made me feel that my thoughts had value. 5 days after returning, I woke up to a message from Adrian. It was a photo of a waterfall even more impressive than the one we had visited together, accompanied by the words, "Thought you'd like to see this. Some discoveries deserve to be shared." My heart skipped a beat. I immediately replied with a photo of the view from my window. It was nothing extraordinary, just buildings and a small square. But I said, "It's not as impressive as your view, but it has its charm. How's the trail?" "Amazing, but different. I keep waiting for someone to show up to share the best moments." I understand completely. The city is different too. Louder but somehow more bearable. You've changed. We both have. That was the first of many message exchanges that became part of my daily routine. Adrian would send me photos of the places he passed through, and I would share details of my urban life that I used to think were mundane, but, in his eyes, gained interest. We talked about work, about future plans, about how those 3 days in the forest continued to impact our daily lives. 2 weeks later, he called me for the first time since we had parted. Hearing his voice brought back all the sensations of those days together. The security, the connection, the feeling of being completely accepted. "I'm heading home for the weekend," he said. "I was thinking, would you like to meet up? Halfway between our cities?" "I'd love to." We arranged to meet in a small tourist town that was exactly halfway between where we lived. I would spend the night there. We would have a whole weekend to find out if what was born in the forest could survive in the real world. The week leading up to our meeting passed in a mix of expectation and anxiety. What if the magic was just a product of isolation? What if we found out we had nothing in common outside that specific context? What if the person I had fallen for only existed in my idealized memory? All these doubts disappeared the moment I saw him waiting at the door of the small hotel where we had arranged to meet. The smile he gave me was exactly the same one I remembered, and when we hugged, my body immediately recognized his. "You look good," he said, watching me carefully. "You too." "The trail did you good." "It wasn't the trail. It was you. Continuing to carry what I learned with you." We spent that weekend talking, walking around the small town, dining in small restaurants, rediscovering each other outside the context of the forest. And we discovered that the connection had not only survived, it had grown. Adrian was exactly the same person I had met in the forest, but now I could see him in layers. His kindness to waiters, his genuine curiosity about the stories of the places we visited, his way of listening not only to what I said but to what I couldn't express. On our last night together, lying in the bed of the small hotel, he said, "You know what I discovered? Those 3 days in the forest weren't a parenthesis in real life. They were real life. Everything else is the parentheses." He was right. What we had found in each other wasn't an escape from reality. It was the truest reality either of us had ever experienced. Now, 6 months later, our relationship is a unique mix of halfway meetings, daily messages, long phone calls, and the growing certainty that some connections are strong enough to transcend distance and circumstances. Adrian continues his trails, but now sometimes I accompany him. I discovered that I love the feeling of being disconnected from the digital world and completely present in nature. He comes to my city regularly, and he's considering asking for a transfer to a school closer by. We don't know yet how our story will end, or if it will end, but we have learned that some things don't need definitive endings to be meaningful. They can be continuous chapters that are written day after day, encounter after encounter, choice after choice. What I know for sure is that the man who showed up at my tent in the middle of the night fundamentally changed who I am. He taught me that we deserve to be completely seen and accepted, that real intimacy is possible, and that sometimes the best things in life arrive exactly when we stop looking for them. What you hear here is just the beginning. The complete, unfiltered stories with all the details you can imagine are available now. Check out the link in the description right now. If this story touched you in some way, if you also believe that there are encounters that transform our lives in a matter of days, leave a like and subscribe to the channel. Share in the comments. What was the most unexpected and transformative encounter of your life? And don't forget to turn on the notification bell, because every week we bring stories about human connections that remind us of what really matters in life. Thanks for listening to my story, and we'll see you in the next episode.